The day was one carved into ceremony. Flags rippled in the early morning breeze, their colors bright against the marble white of the memorial steps. Rows of chairs stretched out across the plaza, filled with dignitaries, veterans, and families clutching photographs of loved ones. Television cameras lined the perimeter, their lenses trained on the podium draped in red, white, and blue. The president was scheduled to speak, his words prepared to honor the fallen. For many, it was just another public ritual, solemn but predictable. Yet for one man standing among the silent guards, this day would be different. The tomb guard had stood watch through storms, through sleepless nights, through the endless turning of seasons. His body knew the stillness. His mind knew the discipline. His soul knew the vow. He had watched countless ceremonies pass before him, speeches flowing like rivers of polished words, sometimes sincere, sometimes hollow. But today, he carried something weightier than silence. Hidden in his pocket was a folded letter, worn at the edges, its ink faded but legible. It had been written by a soldier decades earlier, discovered recently among belongings long forgotten. The words had never reached their intended destination. The guard had read them once, his heart trembling at their raw honesty. And though he was not a messenger by duty, he knew in his bones that this letter demanded a voice. The band struck up a slow march, and the president approached the podium. The crowd rose to its feet, applause echoing briefly before dying into silence. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every movement, every expression. The president adjusted his notes, ready to deliver a speech that would be broadcast across the nation. The guard's heart pounded steadily, each beat a drum against his ribs. He had never broken formation in his life, had never once stepped out of line, but today he knew he must. The president began to speak. His words were eloquent, carefully crafted. He spoke of sacrifice, of unity, of the eternal debt owed to the fallen. Families listened, some nodding, others holding back tears. Veterans sat stiffly, their hands folded tightly in their laps. The guard listened too, but the letter in his pocket burned like fire. These words, though noble, were not enough. There was another voice that needed to be heard, the voice of a soldier who had never come home. The moment came without warning. The president paused briefly to turn a page of his notes. In that pause, the guard moved. His boots struck the marble with sharp finality, breaking the still rhythm of the ceremony. Heads turned instantly. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The cameras swiveled, lenses capturing the impossible. A tomb guard breaking a centuries-old stillness, striding toward the most powerful man in the country. Secret Service agents reacted at once. Hands moved to earpieces, bodies tensed, ready to intercept. But the guard's face bore no threat. It was carved in solemnity, his movements deliberate, reverent. His hand reached into his pocket and withdrew the folded letter, held carefully between gloved fingers, as though it were a relic, not mere paper. The president looked up, startled. His speech halted mid-sentence. The crowd gasped. One of the agents stepped forward, but the guard raised the letter higher, his eyes steady, his silence commanding more power than any shouted explanation could have. For a moment, the entire ceremony hung suspended. The president's gaze locked with the guard's. Something in that unblinking stare told him this was not disruption, but devotion. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out and accepted the letter. The guard bowed his head slightly, then stepped back, resuming his rigid stance as though nothing had happened. The square was stunned. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to clap, to whisper, to breathe. The cameras caught every second, broadcasting it live to millions of homes. The president unfolded the worn paper, his hands trembling slightly as he saw the faded handwriting. His lips moved as he scanned the first lines, and the color drained from his face. Around him, silence deepened. No one knew yet what the letter contained, but the weight of it was visible in the way his shoulders sagged, the way his eyes glistened. The speech prepared by aides now seemed lifeless, irrelevant. The forgotten letter had taken its place, and the world leaned forward in anticipation. In the crowd, families clutched one another, sensing that something sacred was unfolding. Veterans straightened in their seats, as though the words of one of their own were about to return from beyond time. Even the Secret Service agents, still poised for action, hesitated, their eyes fixed on the letter that had disarmed the president more thoroughly than any weapon could. The guard remained still, his duty complete. He had not spoken, not explained, but he had delivered what needed to be delivered. Whether the president read it aloud, whether the world heard the words, was no longer in his hands. He had fulfilled a promise to the fallen that their voices would not be lost in the corridors of history. The president lifted his eyes from the letter, and the entire plaza waited. His expression was unreadable, torn between grief and awe, as though the ink on the page had reached across decades to pierce his heart. Slowly, he set aside his prepared notes. He looked once more at the guard, then back at the crowd. His lips parted, but for a long moment, no words came. The ceremony that had begun as routine was no longer routine at all. Something irreversible had begun, and by the end of it, the world would not be the same. The president stood frozen with the paper in his hand, the weight of it far heavier than any prepared speech. The crowd leaned forward, the silence so deep that even the faint rustle of flags above the memorial seemed loud. For a moment, he did not read aloud. His eyes moved slowly across the faded ink, his lips forming words without sound, his chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. Then, with a voice quieter than anyone expected, he began. "It is the spring of 1944. His voice cracked on the date, and the audience gasped. The letter was not from an aide, not from a modern veteran, it was from a soldier long gone. The president steadied himself and continued, "I do not know if this letter will ever reach home. They told us we would leave at dawn. I think of you every hour. If I fall, I want you to know that I was not afraid. My fear was not of death, but of being forgotten. I ask only this: if I do not return, tell the world I was here. If I do not see tomorrow, I hope someone will carry these words to you." The president's voice faltered, and for a moment he pressed the paper to his chest, as if to hold back the flood of emotion rising in him. "Tell them my name had weight, not because of medals or rank, but because I loved my country, my family, and the life I hoped to build." Around the plaza, people were already in tears. Mothers clutched photographs tighter, fathers wiped their eyes roughly. Veterans stared at the ground, their lips trembling. Even the police officers stationed at the perimeter stood solemn, their rigid posture softening. The president lifted the letter again, his voice stronger now, though edged with grief. "I ask one more thing. If there is ever someone who stands guard over me, let them remember not only my duty, but my laughter, my small joys, my humanity. Let them know I was more than a uniform. I was a son, a friend, perhaps someday a father. And if none of this survives, let at least these words live. We were here and we mattered." His hands trembled as he lowered the letter. The silence was total. No chant, no applause, no cough broke it. It was as if the entire world had been pierced by the voice of a boy who never came home, carried across decades by paper and ink, delivered by a guard who refused to let it be lost. The president's eyes glistened. He looked at the guard, who remained at attention, immovable, his gaze fixed forward. The leader of the nation straightened, lifted the letter for all to see, and declared, "These are not just his words. These are the words of every soldier who never returned, every family who still waits, every sacrifice we must never reduce to speeches or ceremonies. This is the truth." The crowd erupted not in cheers but in sobs, in shouts of gratitude, in a wave of clapping that was less applause than release. Strangers embraced, veterans saluted with shaking hands, children buried their faces in their parents' shoulders. The letter had done what no modern speech could. It stripped away politics and left only humanity. Across the globe, the broadcast carried on live. In living rooms, families watched in stunned silence. News anchors broke into tears as they narrated. Social media flooded with the words of the letter, shared and reshared until it became a collective vow. In the days that followed, newspapers called it the letter that stopped a nation. The president himself ordered it preserved in the archives, not as a relic but as a living testament. Schools read it aloud in classrooms. Veterans carried copies folded into their wallets. Gold Star families placed it beside photographs of their loved ones, comforted that the world had finally paused to listen. But the guard who had delivered it remained silent. He returned to his post at the tomb the very next day, standing as he always had, unmoved by storms or heat. To him, his duty had not changed. He had not sought attention, had not wished for fame. He had simply carried out the promise he felt in his soul, to give voice to the voiceless, to make sure the forgotten were remembered. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the crowd of visitors drifted away, a small group of veterans approached him. They carried no cameras, no signs, only quiet reverence. One of them, his hair white, his hands trembling, whispered, "You reminded them that we were more than uniforms." "Thank you." The guard gave a slight nod, his face steady, but in his chest a quiet warmth spread. The world moved on, but the moment remained etched in memory. The president's tears, the mother's sob, the silence of millions watching these became part of the nation's collective story. The epilogue lingered in whispers. Sometimes the most powerful truths do not come from podiums or offices, but from letters written in the dark, from voices that feared being forgotten, from men who carried promises across generations. And at the heart of it was a single guard who had broken centuries of stillness not for himself, but for a boy whose words had waited 70 years to be heard. And sometimes it takes one act of courage, one guard stepping forward to bring those truths into the light. The takeaway was clear. Honor is not maintained by speeches alone. It lives in the act of remembering, in carrying forward the words of those who can no longer speak. And when the world listens, when the forgotten are finally heard, tears become not weakness, but tribute.